Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, let's get started. I'll try to get you out of here at a decent hour. No promises. Okay, so we are in chapter 2 of the book of John. Where'd it go? Okay, chapter 2 of the book of John. The next day, there was a wedding celebration in the village of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. The wine supply ran out during the festivities, so Jesus' mother told him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, that is not our problem," Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." But his mother told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Standing nearby were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each could hold 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus told the servants, "Fill the jars with water." When the jars had been filled, he said, "Now dip some out and take it to the master of ceremonies." So the servants followed his instructions. And when the master of ceremonies tasted the water that was now wine, not knowing where it had come from, though of course the servants did know, he called the bridegroom over. "A host always serves the best wine first," he said. "Then, when everyone has a lot to drink, he brings out the less expensive wine, but you have kept the best until now." This miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After the wedding, he went to Capernaum for a few days with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration, so Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. Jesus made a whip from some rope and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then going over to the people who sold the doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." Then his disciples remembered this prophecy from the scriptures, "Passion for God's house will consume me." But the Jewish leaders demanded, "What are you doing? If God gave you authority to do this, show us a miraculous sign to prove it." "All right," Jesus replied, "destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." "What?" they exclaimed. "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days?" But when Jesus said this temple, he meant his own body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed both the scriptures and what Jesus had said. Because of the miraculous signs Jesus did in Jerusalem at the Passover celebration, many began to trust in him. But Jesus didn't trust them because he knew human nature. No one needed to tell him what mankind is really like. So, we've been talking about John, and we've been going over this arc, this story arc that we call the light of all men, to introduce Christ as being the light. And light has a very specific quality, and so on and so forth. And we talked about God giving people a stamp of approval that leads them to righteousness. And we talked about that stamp of approval only coming in the guise of self-sacrifice, that somebody has to be willing to sacrifice themselves. So today, we're going to be talking about, well, more of the same, except we're moving on to a different arc. This arc is called the path of the righteous. And as you can see, there is a lot of sermons in this arc. It's going to take us all the way to July, looks like. July 7th, right? It's July the 7th month? I think so. It's going to take us all the way to July, so get comfortable with this arc. But anyway, this is the path of the righteous. Now, to introduce the path of the righteous, we have a pretty interesting area of Scripture. There's a lot to talk about here, and I, true to form, am going to talk about one single element within this whole lot to talk about, and then I'm going to jump into like 20,000 different pools at the same time. So, there are 3 really, really, truly significant areas of this portion of Scripture. And I really enjoy talking about pretty much all of them. There's one, which is what? What's the first one? What's the first thing that happens? The wedding at Cana, okay? The wedding at Cana is interesting. It's significant. It's the first of Jesus' miracles. The first miracle that he performed was to do what? Turn water into wine. We all know this. It's really funny because people try to turn Christianity into a prohibition religion, and it's obviously not, if the very first thing that Jesus did was turn water into wine. With that said, it's also interesting because of the relationship of Jesus with who? With his mother. And it's interesting the way that Jesus interacts with Mary. So we got that. What's the second part? The temple. The scene with the money changers. I always reference the scene with the money changers. Michelle says I'm becoming an old man because I always talk about how Jesus did not just turn over the tables, but he went back and he made a whip. So those of you who think that I'm just making that up, no, it's there. Okay? He made a whip. Now what's the last part? Yeah, I mean, I look at that more as the interaction with the Pharisees. So Jesus has this interaction with the Pharisees. And eventually that's going to lead us into really the starting place for the path of the righteous, where we get to meet this character named Nicodemus. But before we get to Nicodemus, we're going to talk about these three super polarizing events. They're really, really interesting because they display something about Jesus that you really don't see. They display polarity. Now Jesus, he's really, really humble. He's really, really down to earth. He's known for hanging out with everybody who has issues. He's known for hanging out with pretty much anybody, right? That's what people of all cultures and creeds tend to try to accept Jesus and syncretize him and take him and pull him as to who they want him to be. And the reason they can do that is because Jesus is super, super down to earth. Literally. But with that said, here we find something completely different. Here we find three events where we get to see a little bit of Jesus' character that's really different. In the first event, we see Jesus being a little bit cheeky with his mom. A little bit defiant. Just a little bit, okay? Then we see Jesus going to the temple and being absolutely irate, livid even. Then we see Jesus being distrusting, right? That's a very, very powerful thing that Jesus says at the end, or that's said about Jesus at the end of chapter 2. I think it's really, really interesting. It says, because of the miraculous signs Jesus did in Jerusalem at the Passover celebration, many began to trust in him. But Jesus didn't trust them. Why? Because he knew human nature. No one needed to tell him what mankind is really like. That's an incredibly bitter sounding statement, isn't it? And what is the context of this statement? Help me out. Yes, Beth, it is because they killed him. But what is the context of this statement? Give me the hermeneutical context of the statement. What is hermeneutics? It's the proper explanation of a passage, okay? It's the proper way of looking at a passage. So when I want the hermeneutical context of this statement, I want the who, what, where, when, why of this passage. It's really all the same in that regard. Remember what separates this from the other gospel accounts. Who wrote this? John. And John was who? Say that again. Yes. Yes, yes. This is an incredibly emotional statement. This is John. This is Jesus' best friend, who sums up his statement with, "And his glorious ministry began." But deep in the depths of man, there was lurking an evil. That's what's being said here. John, who experienced the death of his best friend, is saying that something wicked this way comes. And in his mind, this is bittersweet, right? The beginning of Christ's ministry is bittersweet for John. Because what does it lead to? It leads to the greatest suffering human history has ever recorded. So, I want to take a look at that. When we initially talked about John chapter 1, and not about the light aspect of it, but when we initially talked about baptism aspect of it, and we talked about what it was that was required in order to have a stamp of approval, or rather, what it means to be righteous and receive a stamp of approval, we said that it was bookended by what? Death. That death is the bookend for righteousness. That the righteous path begins with death and it ends with death. Now, let me just add to that ultimately, though it ends with death on a finite level, there is also this concept of breaking away from death and being reborn and risen through Christ. But with that said, you have the bookends of righteousness with death. And here, we have three passages that seem different to each other, but they're not. Here in John chapter 2, we can still see this theme going on. So, let's take a look at the wedding at Cana. So, essentially, what happens at the wedding at Cana is that everybody has gotten trashed, essentially. They've gone through everything they have that's fine, and they have nothing left, okay? And Jesus' mother comes up to Jesus, and she says, "You can do something about this, can't you?" Right? I mean, the text says that she just said to him, "Here's what happened." But we know that there's an implied context here with the motherdom of Mary. We know that Mary is not afraid to approach Jesus and say, "I know there's something special about you. I think you can do something about this." And I think that that's pretty interesting and bold of her. So she just says to him, "They have no more wine." That's all she says to him. And Jesus says, "Dear woman," now this is the NLT. In the King James Version, it just says woman. But in the NLT version, it says, "Dear woman, that is not our problem." And then he said, "My time has not yet come." What's the implication of that? What is Christ saying? Why? Right, because this for Christ is all about his ministry. And remember what we talked about also last week. In order for self-sacrifice to be relevant, there must be intent behind it. It has to fit into the right context. So what is it that Christ says? He says, "It's not my time yet." And what does Mary say to that? Yep. She walks over to the servants and she says, "Do what he tells you." Now why does she do that? Because she knows he's going to do it. Because Jesus was a what? He was obedient, but he was a what? He was a Jew. Is there anything besides that? Jesus was a Jew, and in Jewish culture, it is a violation of the law to not obey your parents. Now, let's throw this out there, though, that Mary never said, "You must do this." Mary is playing a precarious game of cat and mouse with Jesus and and his special abilities, okay? She's dancing around things, but she's manipulating, she's pulling an Eve. She's utilizing her connection to Jesus in order to accomplish what? The wedding at Cana. Now, don't you think that it's interesting that the very, very first miracle is this one? Jesus could have just said, no way, and the story would end there, okay? But what would have happened? Okay, what else? So the story wouldn't be present. What else? Yep. What else? What? That's true too. What else? Let me paint it in a different picture. We'll go with Aiden, okay? Let's say for a second that Aiden is Christ. So, Aiden is told by Heidi, something needs to be done here. And Aiden says, woman, I don't think so. End of chapter. What's the implication? Okay, and now to connect it to what Brittany is saying, not only would it be an invalidation of a commandment, so you have the mechanical side of things, but it would also be invalidating the relationship between him and his mom also. It was very, very important that Jesus followed through with this. It was incredibly important because what it did was it validated, it gave a stamp of approval. And how is it the stamp of approvals come with God? But how do they come? Like, how does that work? What's the relationship? There's always a what? A sacrifice. There's always a sacrifice involved. What did Jesus sacrifice here? His time. And this is really, really important. Christ kickstarted his ministry in sacrificing for the love of his mother and for not just the love of his mother, but for the whole history of humankind, understanding that Mary is something to be cherished and not just a woman, even though the Roman Catholic Church took that and made a doctrine out of it that's much bigger than that. But with that said, he took his own time and sacrificed that. And when we talk about him sacrificing his own timing, we're not just talking about him sacrificing his own timing, are we? It's not like he had an appointment at 6 and it's 5 o'clock now, so we can go ahead and start early. Right? We're talking about the march to what? Yeah. To Calvary. To Golgotha. Hill of the Skull. His march to death. So in this, we see the sacrifice of Christ. Now, this is the beginning of Christ's public ministry. And what was the first thing he did? Yes, he obeyed his mother. He sacrificed his own timing in order that his mother would be cherished, essentially. Now, when we look at the temple, he goes to the temple. And what is it that he sees there? Let me paint the picture for you. In Jewish culture, how do you get clean before God? How do you make relationship connect? Sacrifices, right? You make sacrifices to God. very specific sacrifices. Sacrifices of bulls and lambs and doves and certain other types of birds and so on and so forth. This is how you get clean before God. Now, as a human being, what do we call this? As American human beings. As American human beings living in a capitalist society, what would I call this? Yes, I would call this an opportunity for supply and demand. And that is exactly what had happened in the temple. What had happened in the temple was that people needed to make sacrifices to be right before God. Yeah. And on top of going the lazy way about it, on top of that, they also, so that's the people in the temple, the Pharisees and the scribes and all these people, they all knew what was going on. The temple workers were jacking up the price. Okay? Because that's supply and demand. That's what we do. They realized that people had this need. And so what did they do? They sold these things for an exorbitant amount. Kind of like stopping at an airport's a good example. I was thinking of a gas station. You know, you want to buy some ramen at a gas station, you're going to pay $6 for one. You know, you need a battery, you're going to pay $12. Like, why? Because it's convenient. Now remember, convenience in our day and age is way different than convenience in their day and age. Okay? For us, it is as simple as going to a place in our car with electricity while listening to music. You know? For them, they had to go out by foot, catch these things, and prepare these things on their own, and store these things without freezers and refrigerators and saran wrap and all these different things, and they had to take them to the temple. This was an experience, okay? There's a reason why it only happened so often that they had to do it. This was a huge event, and it all happened kind of around the time of Passover. So Jesus comes to the temple, and what does he find? He finds that the people in the temple are jacking up the prices. And so, to a human being who lives in a capitalistic society, that's okay. In fact, good for them. But to a man of righteousness who understands that our relationship with God is predicated upon grace, upon the ability to freely come before God with a free exchange of ideas, with a free exchange of our traumas, with a free exchange of his love. What does that look like? The people in the temple were becoming a buffer. Not only were they becoming a buffer, but they were standing in the way. They were a blocker. They weren't just buffering. They were an active blocker of the relationship between God and man. There are many things that God will suffer. Christ suffered even unto death. Right? But why did he do that? What? So we can come to him. Now think about this. Christ was willing to die so that we could come to him freely. He comes into the temple, and what does he see? He sees the people who are supposed to be the carriers of his message doing what? Doing everything they can to make sure that people can't come freely before God. So what does he do? He gets angry. And why shouldn't he get angry? But there's an implication here, isn't there? What is the implication? It's true. But as mankind, what's the implication? You are the Pharisees, you are the scribes, you are the Sadducees, you are the Sanhedrin. You are the priesthood of this temple. And this man has come in and messed with your what? With your money, with your income. Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., but Martin Luther. Martin Luther said to the Roman Catholic Church, you have all these issues with you. Why aren't you fixing them? This doesn't make sense, and this doesn't make sense. And he posted over 90 reasons why the Roman Catholic Church needed reform. And you know what the Roman Catholic Church did? It laughed at him until he went and posted 90-something more reasons that all had to do with what? Money. With money. And so once money is messed with, what does the Roman Catholic Church say? It says, if you do not be quiet, if you don't shut up, you are excommunicated from God. Money's a big deal. In Christ, he was messing with their money. What do you think happened from this one moment? Yes. This was the moment when Christ said, here I am. This was the moment when he painted a target onto himself. And he said, come get me. So the Pharisees, they get on his case. And then what does he attack? He had already done that. After that, the Pharisees get on his case. And they say, who said that you could do this? Who said that you could mess with our livelihood, that our income? You're from God? Prove it. Show me a miracle that proves that you're from God. And what is it that Christ says? So then Christ starts talking about their temple. Now, it's very important for you to know this. There are lots of different ideologies in Jewish culture, okay? There's all sorts of different types of things in Jewish culture. But there's one thing that all the Jews believe in terms of physicalness. They believe in God, they believe in all these different things, okay? But in terms of the physical reality, the Jews are super malleable. Why are they super malleable? Because it really doesn't matter what makes you a Jew besides this one thing. And no, it's not circumcision. The Jews have a fundamental understanding about the temple. All the Jews want the temple. Whether it's the Jews now, where the temple doesn't exist, or whether it was the Jews back then, or whether it was the Jews in 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed. In fact, historians are so sure of this fact that they actually date things based upon whether Jewish literature talks about the temple being destroyed in 70 AD. Because to the